All right, good morning, everyone. What a privilege to be here with you this morning. Thank you so much for joining us. So when Katrina and Julian asked me to speak at this wonderful event, they said, we want you to speak about the role of business and the expectations about COP28. I was like, wonderful, great topic. Do I have about an hour, 90 minutes, something like that? And Katrina turns and says, you have 20 minutes. I was like, wonderful. Okay, so I made two promises to myself for today. One, to keep it within the 20 minutes, and therefore I scripted what I wanted to say to you. But second, and most importantly, perhaps a promise that we should make ourselves for today is to avoid the easy path of doom and gloom when we look at the scientific facts about COP28. Let's be optimistic, let's be proactive, let's be more impactful today. So here goes. So as I'm sure all of you know, COP28 presents a significant milestone in our collective journey towards climate action. As I'm sure you already know, the Conference of the Parties started convening in 1995. That's 3 decades that we've been discussing climate change. And the challenge here is to forge those global agreements and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and do our best to mitigate climate change impacts. These conferences have been, in fact, instrumental in fostering this international cooperation and to some extent, at least, propelling climate action. Hence, for example, the Paris Agreement. Now, there's no question that the urgency to address climate change is both clear and immediate, right? Some recent assessments that we know, they conclude that we have only a 50% chance of staying within the 1.5 degrees Celsius. And to do that, we have a remaining carbon budget of about 250 gigatons of CO2. How long is that? How long is that going to take us at current emissions? 6 years. 6 short years before we hit the boundary of only 50% chance of hitting 1.5. Now, 2 months ago, September 2023, the global temperature anomaly sounded alarms across the scientific community. Not only did we witness the hottest September on record, but also 2023 is now on track to be the warmest year ever, with surface temperatures being around 1.75 degrees warmer than pre-industrial times and pushing this year's average to 1.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, right? The implications of this trajectory couldn't be more profound. And of course, the stakes could not be higher. The science confirms an existential urgency to take decisive action. So as we head to COP28, unfortunately, the whole atmosphere is a little bit of a cautious optimism at best, which of course reflects the complex and inherently political nature of global climate negotiations and climate diplomacy, right? I would argue that the global community's expectations remain at best cautiously optimistic. So, of course, the road to COP28 is not about policy alone. It's a more holistic effort. It calls on us, the business community, to introspect, to engage, and to mobilize in alignment with our sustainability goals. So, looking at the agenda for today's event, and we do have an exciting day ahead of us, I'm confident that our discussions are not going to be just academic. They will have to be a call to action, and urging all of us from our respective roles to realign our business strategies, our business mindsets even, with the global sustainability agenda. So hopefully in so doing, we also cultivate a more collaboration to tackle these quite unprecedented challenges. So as we go through today's rich agenda, I invite each one of you to engage with an open mind, to embrace the spirit of constructive but also fierce debate, and to contribute actively to our discussions across the day and across the various panels. What I would like to do next is share with you some of my views about the expectations for COP28 and, in fact, the interplay between COP28 and business strategy. Now, first, let me start by saying it's important to understand that COP28 is not just another annual gathering, but I do honestly think it's a crucial turning point. This year, we start at the threshold of the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement, which is a comprehensive process that evaluates the progress of nearly 200 nations toward the ambitious climate targets that we collectively set in 2015. This stocktake, which started last year, is set to culminate at COP28, and it will reflect how far we've come, or rather perhaps how far we have not come in our path to confine global warming within the thresholds of 1.5 to 2 degrees. This technical assessment concluded, as I'm sure many of you may have read it, with the synthesis report in September 2023, and sadly, it painted a very dire picture. Despite an increase in the number of countries that are adopting CO2 reduction targets, the existing pledges are not on track to keep temperature rise under 1.5 degrees. In fact, global temperatures optimistically are projected in the 2.4 to 2.7 degrees range by the end of the century. This is far beyond the Paris Agreement targets. So against this backdrop, COP28 will host and will discuss some key policy discussions on some critical issues, including the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund and the global momentum towards phasing out, as opposed to phasing down, fossil fuels and CO2 fossil fuels. Now, I do think that the Loss and Damage Fund, it is a historic development. This fund is the first United Nations mechanism to help countries that have already suffered irreversible climate-driven damage. However, the successful operationalization, beginning with the World Bank hosting this fund, it does inevitably face geopolitical tensions and reflects broadly the challenges that will have to be addressed at COP28. Now, developing and developed countries have made significant concessions to facilitate an agreement, but big questions still remain unanswered about who will contribute to this fund and when. Now, importantly though, COP28 is often described as the implementation COP. That's because the conclusion of this stocktake exercise that I talked about earlier is supposed to set a roadmap of how exactly we're going to accelerate climate action. As I mentioned just now, it's also the stage where we hope to operationalize this loss and damage fund, and for the parties to agree on the frameworks that will enhance overall climate resilience and adaptation. At the same time, the negotiations will focus heavily, of course, on climate finance, with the Standing Committee on Finance preparing a report on the developed countries' pledge to double adaptation finance by 2025. So the emphasis there is not only going to be on meeting the $100 billion pledge that countries have done in the past, but also to start thinking about post-2025 climate finance, and in fact, update that pledge and set a new target for climate finance. Now, all of these ambitious, challenging, and often contested agenda items, of course, reinforce the idea that COP28 is about turning previous commitments into action and deciding concrete steps forward. Now, these issues, all of the ones I just mentioned, of course, underscore the critical link between these global climate policies and the business landscape. In fact, the business community finds itself at the crossroads of these discussions, with the decisions that we will hopefully take at COP28 very likely to influence a whole host of factors, including regulatory frameworks, policy commitments, investor expectations, even potentially consumer preferences. So what does that mean for us? It means that there's a need for a robust roadmap in terms of how we're going to realign our strategies with climate targets, and in so doing, to set a pragmatic, but hopefully optimistic and ambitious path forward for business. In fact, and this is a lot of the work that I do is in terms of the integration of environmental and social issues into strategy more broadly, we know that the business world is already undergoing a profound transformation, a disruption, as I often call it. It's a slow but steady shift from rhetoric to tangible action. So this change is evident in businesses not only in terms of innovating their products to be more socially and environmentally responsible, but also in terms of how they entirely restructure their operating and business models, doing their best to align with the planet's limits. So this fundamental shift is motivated by several factors, of course, to create value, to manage risks, to comply with the emerging laws and regulations, to better manage the stakeholder ecosystem that actually places these demands on business, and of course, as part of the broader effort to really redesign and reconstruct the entire infrastructure within which our industries operate. Now, there's no question in my mind that the engagement of the business sector, especially when it comes to climate, but also broadly with sustainability issues, has moved from considered an optional extra, something wonderful to do on Friday afternoon activity, to a core and fundamental element of strategic management. In fact, you'll even see that some companies already think about beyond net zero, and they talk about, so companies like Microsoft, for instance, say not only will be net zero, but we're going to be net negative, hoping to take out of the atmosphere all the CO2 that we have put in since the founding of the company. Now, just an example of several commitments that reflect a growing recognition that the urgency of climate action and the role that us, in other words, corporate leaders, can play in really driving sustainability forward. Now, reflecting at least some of the themes that we're going to see at COP28 and in the various panels that we're going to see today, is of course the commitment to renewable energy, which has seen a significant surge in recent years. So give you some numbers. In 2022, the global investment in energy transition technologies, including renewables, reached a record high of $1.3 trillion. But even with those amounts, the investment still falls short of the average annual investment that is needed to remain on track for 1.5 degrees. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, estimates that around 2.8 trillion will be invested in energy in 2023, with over $1.7 trillion directed towards clean energy, which includes renewables, nuclear, grid storage, and low-emission fuels. Now, it's important to understand kind of these numbers vis-a-vis fossil fuels, because these are significant increases in clean energy investment. To give you a sense, it's 24% for renewables versus only 15% for fossil fuels, and again demonstrates this hopefully decisive shift towards in our investment priorities. Now, even more recently, and ahead of COP28, over 100 CEOs from the Alliance of CEO Climate Leaders have issued an open letter urging both the public and private sectors to adopt transformative policies to accelerate decarbonization efforts. Their message is clear. Without bold action and enhanced collaboration, the goal of a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 will remain elusive. And some of you may have already seen the UN report that came out yesterday. According to the estimates, we need a 45 to 50% reduction by 2030. What are we on track on? Anybody knows? An increase of 9%. So we're moving at speed, but in the wrong direction. I'm going back on my second promise of avoiding the doom and gloom. So let me return to my script. I believe that this interplay between government policy and political will, to the extent that it exists, and we'll talk about that in a bit, and proactive steps by businesses, in fact, underline what I mentioned earlier as the essence of COP28, which is to have an implementation COP. In fact, I do think that the private sector and the business sector's commitment, and importantly, and this reflects back to what Julian was saying about business as problem solvers, right? And therefore, the innovation capabilities that we bring to the table, combined always with supportive regulatory policies and frameworks and the necessary infrastructure, are absolutely pivotal for this transformation or this transition to net zero. So let's be a bit more specific. Let's go from the general to the more specific and think about how potentially these COP28 discussions and potential outcomes may affect or could shape or at least impact business strategies. I mean, we're only going to know once we see the outcomes, but let's play this thought experiment. So first, there's no question that at COP28, we're going to see a huge push to accelerate the transition to clean energy. And this will require, in many cases, a significant acceleration. Perhaps for some companies, it's going to be a strategic shift towards embedding sustainability more deeply within operations and business models. Companies will have to adapt by investing more in renewable energies, rethinking energy procurement strategies, and funding innovation aimed at reducing emissions. These alignment will have to move beyond environmental responsibility. It is and will become even more so a business imperative, and will be motivated by, of course, the need to create value, regulatory pressures, market dynamics, and in some industries, changing consumer expectations. I think that companies across industries are likely to also emphasize the crucial role of collaboration, especially in those industries where the transition is more difficult and sticking your head out first as a business can be risky. But also collaboration between businesses and government in order to fundamentally transform the global energy system and move away from our unhealthy reliance on fossil fuels. Also, this shift towards sustainable energy sources could open doors, of course, to economic growth, new markets, and growth opportunities for companies. And I do think that the companies that do make those investments today, or already started making these investments on more sustainable energy solutions, would benefit from potentially government incentives, tap into these new markets first, and of course build their brands and reputations. Now, to effectively manage this transition, though, it's also crucial for companies to optimize their energy usage, expand their reliance on clean energy sources, and prepare for upcoming policy shifts that favor environmentally friendly alternatives. Now, navigating these challenges, these changes successfully is becoming increasingly vital for businesses, especially those that do want to maintain or enhance their competitive edge in a very dynamic landscape. As I mentioned earlier, and we discuss this a lot in our classes here at LBS, looking at sustainability and the energy transition as a disruption as opposed to a path with a rosy path ahead. Second issue, at COP28, there's a growing expectations that businesses will place a greater emphasis on integrating nature, people, lives, and livelihoods into climate strategies. This approach isn't just about reducing the negative impacts, right? But we hopefully want to move beyond and build an understanding about improving the relationship between what companies do and the broader ecological and social environment. So I both anticipate and hope that an agreed upon policy framework will incentivize companies to take more proactive measures to ensure that their activities positively contribute to environmental sustainability and social well-being. This includes, for example, making supply chains more resilient to climate impacts and actively supporting biodiversity, for example. Now, this focus on people, nature, lives, and livelihoods also highlights the need for a more holistic approach to climate action. It calls for companies to actively contribute to the restoration and preservation of natural ecosystems. And it's broadly about evolving from this idea of simple compliance to laws and regulations to actually focus on a regeneration, which of course will benefit the planet, but will also benefit society, local communities, and so on. I also think that companies will ultimately have to consider more carefully and diligently the social implications of their environmental strategies, and especially their transition plans to net zero emissions. This relates back again to what Julian mentioned as potential trade-offs, right? Because we need to have plans that reflect a transition that is both just and equitable. And this could involve, for example, creating jobs in green industries, ensuring fair labor practices, and supporting community-led initiatives that enhance resilience to climate change. I think that these type of strategies will play an increasingly central role in corporate decision-making as companies seek to align their growth objectives with the broader goals of sustainable development and social equity. Third, the focus on climate finance at COP28 highlights an important shift in perception and handling of climate-related funding. For businesses, this means reevaluation of investment strategies and financial models to better align with the broader goal of sustainable development, especially in developing countries. Indeed, a key aspect of the COP agenda is making climate finance more affordable, available, and accessible, and this may result in increasing funding for green projects, enhanced support for climate adaptation technologies in vulnerable regions, and greater incorporation of sustainability criteria into investment decision-making. I also think that within that context, companies are going to face huge pressures for more transparency and accountability about their climate finance contributions, requiring them to report not only on the amount, but also the effectiveness of their investments in reducing emissions and improving resilience. Now, third, inclusivity in climate action is another central theme of COP28 and marks a shift towards integrating a wide range of perspectives and experiences in addressing climate challenges. I think that for businesses, this means that future strategies will likely need to encompass a broader spectrum of stakeholder interests, particularly those of marginalized communities and future generations. These could result in businesses adopting more community-centered approaches, ensuring their practices not only comply with environmental standards, but actually positively contribute to local economies and their social fabric. Finally, I think there's going to be a development potentially on the legal front. We know that in recent years there's an increase in terms of climate litigation risk. So depending on what decisions and what commitments we collectively make at COP28, for instance, if we do set new benchmarks and expectations, it may well be the case that businesses might find themselves under closer legal scrutiny to ensure compliance with these enhanced standards. So, to summarize, COP28 will likely influence significant shifts in business strategies, emphasizing the urgent need for a transition to clean energy, integrating holistic climate strategies that consider people and nature, and reevaluating climate finance models. The focus on inclusivity in climate action will require companies to adopt more community-focused and socially responsible practices, while the rising trend in climate litigation underscores the need for robust legal preparedness. I think that as we look forward, these themes will be crucial for shaping the corporate approach to not only climate policies, but sustainability more broadly. Now, before I close my talk, it's important to address directly a critical issue, the not-so-green elephant in the room. So the yawning gap between our global climate ambitions and the tangible actions that we take. Despite this widespread consensus on the urgency of climate crisis, there's a troubling disconnect between intentions and real-world actions and outcome. Within the business community, our community, this huge gap between aspirations and actions is equally apparent. While many companies have indeed pledged to reduce carbon emissions and achieve net zero targets, there's a prevailing trend of overstatement and greenwashing. This is partly due, of course, to the still evolving regulatory frameworks, which don't give us clear understanding, well, what does net zero actually mean? But it might also be the fact that these are very, very long-term targets that often constrain or avoid immediate action. But even with these challenges, I think that the majority of companies genuinely do strive and actually experiment profoundly for ways to reduce their carbon footprint. We've also seen a new phenomenon too, by the way. It's not just greenwashing. More recently, we've also seen green hashing, right? Where companies actually shy away from disclosing their environmental efforts, which again highlight a very complex and evolving in this case, political landscape with respect to sustainability. So as we approach COP28 and even beyond COP28, there's a very pressing need to align these lofty climate goals with concrete, actionable steps. So, ladies and gents, it's crucial to acknowledge the challenges and inconsistencies in the path ahead. A recent, stark and sad illustration of this is the UK government's U-turn on their net zero policies. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's decision to delay the ban on new petrol and diesel cars from 2030 to 2035, along with easing energy efficiency targets for rental properties and backtracking on plans to replace gas boilers with heat pumps, exemplifies a concerning trend. This comes, of course, after President Trump withdrew the US from the climate agreement. These steps, taken under the guise of a so-called pragmatic approach, do raise serious questions about the commitment to long-term climate goals in the face of immediate economic and political pressures, or indeed populist or extreme right-wing pressures. This U-turn is not just a local misstep. It sends a disconcerting signal to the global community, suggesting that climate commitments can be relegated when faced with daunting challenges or political expediency. This is a narrative we cannot afford to entertain, and as active citizens should not tolerate, especially at a time when the urgency to act against climate change is paramount. Nevertheless, and despite these challenges, there remains some margin for cautious optimism and a call to action. The road ahead in climate action is indeed fraught with complexities, but it also presents opportunities for transformative change. The discussions at COP28 and the evolving business strategies in response to these conversations are not just formalities. Let's grasp this for a second. They are, in essence, survival strategies for our economies, our communities, and our planet. So as we move forward, let us remember the words of the former UN Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, who said, "There is no plan B, well, because there is no planet B." This is our moment to shift from incremental steps to significant strides in climate action. So as we engage in today's discussions and look towards COP28, let's carry this thought with us. Let's not only envision a sustainable world, but let's actively construct one. Our decisions, our actions will shape our legacy, one that we hope will be marked by stewardship and foresight. As the book says, let's be good ancestors for the generations to come. Let us challenge the status quo and transform our ambitions into tangible actions. The future of our planet hinges on the choices that we make today. So thank you so much for your attention. I wish you an enjoyable, fierce, but productive day ahead. Thank you.
You just stay there. Okay, so thank you, Yanis.
Thank you.
Terrific stuff. We've got a bunch of questions, so keep them coming, but I'm going to pick up on a few of the ones that have come through already. Just a little bit on the regulatory and governmental environment, and then I'll move to kind of business issues. So, question about private initiatives and development of codes of conduct. Actually, let me ask you this specific one. I see mainly protectionist measures, such as the border carbon adjustment mechanism that taxes carbon. And there's also a question around the carbon trading markets. What is your view of the efficacy, if you like, of these types of politically motivated attempts to manage these things, sometimes for climate benefit, sometimes arguably for protectionist reasons?
Yeah, so those are two separate issues, carbon markets and the carbon border tax. But I do think that both highlight the idea that even within the system, there might be market-based solutions that we can take advantage of. So the devil is always in the details in terms of how well do we design and implement this market. So in my view, for instance, the fact that you might have a carbon trading market whereby you reduce the carbon allowances, for instance, in line with what science would require require us to do, and therefore constraining the market and in the process essentially pushing companies to adjust their carbon emissions through an increasing price of these offsets makes sense. But the question is, how is it implemented? Is it global? Well, how does the European versus the Chinese versus an American or the Californian system change? Can we exchange those globally? Because these, in a sense, cannot be local markets because we're addressing a global issue. Right? So again, in those kinds of issues, I would go with sort of devil is in the design details. When it comes to the border adjustment tax, I do understand the arguments that it might be more protectionist, but look, even the Inflation Reduction Act in the US got criticism by the EU that is a protectionist act. Now, we haven't done this before. We need to navigate this. And these are all going back to the issue that climate change and what we do is a global problem. It's a problem of, of the commons, if you like. And we'll just have to work hard and with political will to resolve them. I frankly don't think there's anything, depending on, how who's going to pay for this tax. I don't think there's anything wrong in terms of leveling the playing field and say, if you're producing in Europe with low carbon and someone is trying to undermine you by importing from elsewhere with products that have been produced with high intensity of carbon, of course we should be taxed. Maybe that may create a race to the top by other countries. But again, this is going to be a design feature. What are you going to do with those proceeds? Are you going to increase the size of the government? Are you going to redistribute those tax proceeds back to the people in a progressive or regressive way? So this, again, it's all about those design choices that we make that will determine the outcome.
And we will be coming back to some of these issues around government policy over the course of today. We'll also talk about measurement, and that was another question, but I'm not going to touch on it now. Let's go to corporate strategy, because you, like myself, I mean, we're professors of strategy. We try to help companies to make good choices. Somebody says, I love Colin Mayer's definition of purpose, the one that I used half an hour ago. But are there any good examples of big companies who don't put growth and profitability first?
Yeah, frankly, Julian, I think that this conversation of, profits first, Milton Friedman said this, Milton Friedman is dead. It's been a long while.
Indeed.
So
in every sense, right?
Exactly. So let's actually have a more nuanced argument of what was going on here, right? So if you look at the business world, there's no question that if you see their stakeholder ecosystem, everybody is demanding that they do things differently, whether it's customers, investors, governments, accountability in the supply chain, and so on and so forth. So it's part of a corporate objective, right? Of course, you're a business. You have to remain profitable. But the question is, how are you going to do this? How are you going to do this in a world where the competitive landscape is shifting so fundamentally, because every single demand that you're facing, and these are fundamental demands, right? We're talking about your investors, your customers, and so on. You will need to adapt. So this is an adaptation challenge. And that's so that's why I mentioned before, it's not a rosy picture, right? I don't agree with these views that say, it's all about finding a stakeholder, finding a win-win, dance kumbaya, and the world is going to be a better place. It's not. It's a disruption, and disruptions are deadly. Think about, Sears, Kodak, Polaroid, Blockbuster, and that was an easy disruption compared to sustainability. So that's why I said that sustainability has these two components. You have to start investing in a world where these negative externalities are going to be priced in, so that's a higher cost world. And on top of that, if you have the foresight, you also need to see where will the opportunities arise. Right? But you have to do both. And I think a lot of the companies, may, in rhetoric, focus on the opportunity while misunderstanding the elevated costs, and while at the same time not really building the capability in order to build differentiated positions.
Yeah. So we need to wrap up. I've got one final question for you. I mean, you are absolutely, as you lay out the facts, there's a risk of doom and gloom, as it were.
I avoided it, though. I did try to avoid it.
You did your best to avoid
there
it.
you go.
But, there are some inescapable facts which are really rather uncomfortable. I'm wondering what makes you optimistic? I mean, there must be some things that you see out there, in your conversations with business leaders that at least give you some grounds for optimism. I mean, and I guess I mean particularly around businesses, because those are our primary audience as a business school. What do you see them doing? Do you see any role models that you can really look to and say, this is what others should be
Yeah.
Following?
I think in addition to being, and I'm not saying this in a cheesy way, but in addition to being in the LBS classroom and seeing our current MBAs, our MBAs across executive, and even the early careers, seeing, it used to be the case that 15 years ago, you had to convince people about why they should care about these issues, right? Today, they come in knowing all of these facts and and demanding of us to tell them, how on earth do I do this? Help me do this. Help me bring about that change. So that's one key component of optimism. The second one at the corporate level is the fact that we are witnessing, and I think across the board and in most industries, a profound level of experimentation. Companies are truly putting money into, and we are going to see failures because these are fundamentally difficult issues. These were issues that were always somebody else's problem. Right. These were issues that often they were under the rug, like, emitting all the greenhouse gas emissions, gases, for instance. So there is a wave of profound experimentation, which we have already seen paying off, at least in some industries, like electric vehicles, renewable energy. And I think the first task, which was, let's try to instigate, let's try to start the process of change, to a large degree has been achieved. And now, so that's a point of optimism. And now our key challenge, perhaps even bigger challenge, is how do we accelerate it? Right? And I think that even the fact that we got the conversation to that point is a point of optimism for me as well.
Good. A point of optimism is where we will end. Thank you, Yanis.
Thank you very much.
For your thoughtful ideas.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.